Dun da 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 da. Dun da dun 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 da 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 da. Dun 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 da da. Dun 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 da 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 da. You have reached your Two Spirit Aunties podcast. Please leave us a message after the tone. Da 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 da. In a world of unmet promises and colonial illusions, two intrepid podcast hosts set out to interrupt the cogs of the machinery of whiteness.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun dun!
Welcome to your Two Spirit Aunties podcast. We are your hosts. I am Brianna Bragg.
And I am Shilo Cinnamon Toast Crunch George.
We are excited to have you all here with us again today. Hopefully it's again and you've watched or listened to the other podcast. We hope you are ready for this journey ahead. We will work really hard to bring a bit of truth and a bit of laughter into your world as we navigate this world together. So for like a little bit of transparency, we started recording this podcast at the end of last summer, and we are just now getting around to editing and publishing. So some of the things you might hear during this week's podcast might be a little outdated. We have moved through Omicron, and we are now at a place where risk levels are lowering. So just keep that in mind as you listen to the podcast this week.
So our topic is, I'm living in the middle of a pandemic and I've never done this before and it shows, basically. So my first question is, what are a few things that you've been struggling with during this pandemic? There's probably a litany, a long list. For me, there is. But what are a couple of top ones for you, Brianna, that you can just say, yeah, this has been kind of a struggle for me?
Yeah, I think like the first thing is I freaking love food and I love eating delicious food with people that I love. And that has been one of the hardest things, is not being able to eat with other people. Like just missing that basic like one-on-one time or like group time where we're just all having brunch and enjoying the good food that we create together. That has been a huge one for me. And it's like, you know, Zoom brunches are just not quite the same.
Well, you can do that for a little while, but we're going on, 19 months at this point. I mean, and you and I are pretty strictly in isolation.
Yeah.
We're vaccinated, but like, we're not going out to restaurants. We're not going on vacations. I mean, you go in your van places, but like, you're not hanging out with people really. I'm not, for the most part, unless it's certain specific, very small amount of friends or family. And it's usually outside and distanced, just to be careful and to be respectful of other people in the community. I miss personally our 3-hour dinners at Gustav's, which is German food. I really miss how we order for like 4 people and then get our double chocolate mousse at the end.
Yes,
I really miss that. I miss the food, but I also miss being with you in person and laughing. For me, there's a lot more of an impact on not being able to socialize and be together in person. Like, I think it impacts both my brain and my psychological functioning, but I think it also impacts my body too, and my spirit.
Yeah. At first, when we were trying to figure all this out, we'd have like drive-by hellos with different friends, and like you came over, stayed in your car, and I like remember using the end of the broom to like hand you something through the car window.
Before vaccines. So this is when we were locked down even tighter. So yes.
It was like very early on in the pandemic. Just that severe body ache of not being able to hug the people that you love. Right. So very much like a visceral response.
Yeah.
To not being able to just like be with your people.
It's awful. I think it's probably impacting those of us who really are pretty isolating of ourselves. I think it's much more impactful than we maybe realize because we're in the middle of it. And I guess I'm in my mind right now, I'm sort of making a clear disconnect, but maybe that's not appropriate of folks who are anti-vaxxers who have just been doing whatever they've wanted this entire time, hanging out with whoever they want to. I don't know what that experience is like for them. I try not to think about those people, to be completely honest, because it makes me so angry and rageful. But for people who have been really trying to be conscious of this and careful, a lot of us are still in a trauma mindset and our brains are in a trauma space. And I think we're functioning really well. But once we get past this, and I don't know what past this looks like or when it is going to
Mhm.
be, or I would think it's going to be a gradual process. But I think looking back, we're going to be like, wow, I was more impacted than I thought I was. I thought I was functioning really well. Clearly not.
Yeah, I think that that's going to be the case for a lot of people. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot, just the waves of the pandemic and not the waves that we're like used to talking about, right? Like the waves of case numbers, right? Like set all that aside and zoom out a little bit of the waves of pandemic impact on society. Social anxiety impacted many of us before, but it's going to impact so many of us more moving forward, and what that's going to look like to be like socially engaging with people again. For those of us too that have physically distanced ourselves during this time, my biggest social functions are like the 4 times I go into work, like in the office type setting. And it's not even in the office, it's outside. What is that going to look like moving forward? How are relationships going to be made as Native people? Hugging and being close to one another is a very important part of who we are. When sharing food and sharing ceremony, which is also very physically close, it's just going to be really interesting how we adapt to those things moving forward for those of us that have been so physically distanced.
I agree. Is there going to be anxiety? I've
Mhm.
definitely felt anxiety being around people at certain times in this process. And I think the isolation for me, living out in the country, living by myself, I have my parents close by and some other family, and that's really wonderful. But I also historically have gotten that physical affection from Native community and from other friends who are really family to me as well. And so not having that has been rough. I had a few friends over, it was almost a month ago now, I think. And we haven't really hugged throughout the pandemic because they've been very careful to isolate as well. We've all been very careful with each other. We're all fully vaccinated, but I was able to hug them. And one person I hadn't hugged since the beginning of the pandemic. He was the last person that I hugged before we went into lockdown. And I cried. It was such a wonderful relief and a great feeling, but there was also this residual feeling of, am I going to be safe? Am I going to be okay? Do I need to be careful the next 2 weeks? Even though all of us have been isolating, we're all vaccinated. There's this paranoia and this
Yeah.
hypervigilance that I find really exhausting and I think is going to probably linger and last for a long time, depending on who you are.
Yeah, I think that's so linked to a couple of the other things that I said I was struggling with of the unknown. For the past 2 years, it's just kind of been hovering. We don't really know what's happening, and that uncertainty. And for those of us that have other mental health concerns like myself, right, that hypervigilance gets triggered, and we're not designed to live in that for 2 years or longer. Like our bodies and our minds are not designed to be there that long, and that fear of the unknown is still real as we like experience this mass hypocrisy of people that don't want to get vaccinated for a number of reasons, and people that have a legitimate fear of the reality of history impacting their communities, and then also the folks that are like, we just don't want to get vaccinated because we believe all of these other absolutely absurd things. That balance of like watching it play out and not knowing what's going to happen at the end, right? Like we still don't know. Like we kind of had this idea. And I remember talking to you about it. We were on the phone and I was going for one of my really long night walks because that's when people don't exist outside in my neighborhood. And I was on the phone with you for, I don't know, however long we were on the phone. And we were talking about, oh, it sounds like the vaccine's really promising. It's going to come. Hopefully, it'll be approved in January. I remember that conversation so vividly, probably last October. And we were also talking about how like long vaccines normally take to process. Is that real? And will it come? And then when it does come, okay, great. It'll just take like how long? And I remember like doing the calculations in my mind about like how long it will take to vaccinate enough of the population to like be able to hug people that we love and eat with people that we love and take care of the people that we need to take care of. And here we are with the vaccine and we're begging people to get vaccinated.
It's just excruciating
Mm-hmm.
for me psychologically. I'll just speak for myself. It's just maddening. It makes me angry, it makes me anxious, it makes me frustrated. I'm not angry and frustrated at folks in our communities and other communities of color that are very anxious about the vaccines for historical reasons and current reasons of the government and the medical industrial complex. Those are valid reasons. And I'm always down for a conversation with our community members and our family members who are struggling with that piece. The clear political division that's happening and just utter lack of common sense, utter lack of being able to reflect and think through something in a logical way. I mean, that to me is an indication of a much larger problem,
Yes.
like a much larger systemic problem that's
Yes.
connected to a lot of other issues. And I think just dealing with a pandemic is hard, but it's not in a vacuum. We're not dealing with it in a vacuum. We're dealing with it amongst all these other problems. And it's so overwhelming. My third question was, what are you hoping for the future? And my answer was, it's complicated. Like, I'm not really sure what the future looks like. And I feel like maybe this was a naivety of my youth where I felt like I could sort of see into the future a bit, at least in my own life, and generally know how things might turn out. And then at some point, something happened, and that ability to sort of see into the future or to maybe be able to predict or try to predict just went haywire. And at this point, I'm just like, something's going down and I have no idea how it's going to turn out. I wish I could have some sense just so I could deal with my own anxiety and existential dread, but there's nothing. It's like riding a wave, right? And you're riding this wave with all these other people, and some people have got the assignment right and are doing well, and other people, I don't know what is happening to them, and I have no control over anyone else. I have to give up a lot of my anxiety to Creator and be like, you know what, ancestors and Creator, you're just going to have to deal with this situation. I have literally no idea what to do.
Yeah. I mean, like what you're talking about reminds me of that meme that was going around for a while where it's just like, this is the worst group project we've ever been in.
Yes.
Where you're just like, everyone was supposed to do their part. Everyone had very clear instructions. And here we are with like people bringing misinformation in, confusing the freak out of people.
It's just so diabolical.
Mm-hmm.
And there's these different ideas about why it's happening and who's behind it. You have to be even really careful for people in our understanding. I don't want to be othering other people, but like folks like us, like we have to be really careful to not fall into conspiracy theory too.
Mm-hmm.
Of, oh, it's this big blah, blah, you know what I mean? And it's never so simple usually. I think there's a lot of complicated things. There's a lot of threads. It's never like there's this overlord who's pulling strings. Like, that's not me. I think it's just a lot of little things that have sort of come together, created like a mess.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about too is that it's a system, right? It's not like one person making decisions behind a curtain, right? We're talking about systemic generational issues that were intentionally placed on some of us for the benefit of others, right? And how that is playing out in the pandemic is also very clear. Or like who is being targeted for misinformation, who is having access to healthcare providers that know what they're talking about, who public health is reaching and who they aren't, and the protective factors through generations that have told certain communities that no, you don't listen to these things because they have hurt us, right? And that is very real, and absolutely no judgment for those feelings.
I have a hard time finding words for it. It gets really complicated in my head and then I start getting overwhelmed. And it's somebody told me at some point in the pandemic, I don't remember who it is, but I use this all the time when I'm doing training or talking to people about trauma and our current many of our brains right now is we're kind of like pots on the stove that are simmering almost to boil, and one little thing makes us boil over, like overwhelmed, angry, irritable, whatever the sort of emotion is that comes out. Whereas maybe that one little thing at another time wouldn't have really bothered us and we would have just gone with the flow and had full capacity of our brain. And so I just feel like I have to do a lot of mitigating. I have to do a lot of cutting like social media out for a while, or like a lot of deep breathing, or I need to go outside or go to the forest. I need to do something to get out of that. It's almost like an echo chamber, social media and conversations. And I want to be informed, yet I don't want to get in that overwhelmed state where it's just regurgitation of the same crap.
Yeah, what you're talking about sounds a lot like racial stress, right? The experience of being somebody who is BIPOC, existing in the world, and then finally having one person say one too many levels of
Yeah.
BS, and then exploding, and then knowing that that is all we will be remembered for, is that one moment where it was just too much. And we see that very clearly happening in the pandemic too with people that we love. I mean, like I've experienced that too, where it's just, okay, I worked 14 hours today. I'm going to go sit down. And then my partner says, like, so what's for dinner? And I'm just like, I can't make another decision. Don't ask me things. you know, I feel like also the ways that we're coping though are like grounded in that, and resilience is a maybe not the right word, but grounded in that survivance of hope, right? And that like holding on to that hope. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't really like the term resilience. And as someone who does a lot of trauma informed work, I really don't use that word. I like resistance. I've been trying to think lately of what is that resistance, right? I mean, always there's a resistance to colonization, right? And the colonial mindset. I'm always in that mode. But like, it's also a resistance to losing hope. It's a resistance to that like nihilistic thinking. I think it's a resistance to giving up. So I like the term resistance. Another thing that's helped me cope is I adopted Journey. I adopted a dog in December and I was so alone and isolated. Isolation and aloneness has been a problem for me for a long time. And then it was just really compacted during the pandemic. And so having Journey has been really helpful. I get a lot of physical affection from her. And I also get to focus on someone else and their needs and taking care of her, which I think helps me get out of this like kind of mindset that I'm just kind of wrapped up in my own needs. She helps remind me of that too. And so that has been super helpful for me for coping. I think having a lot of really solid friendships has been great, even though a lot of those friendships have taken place over Zoom or text messages. Although I've been able to see people more this summer, which has been great. I've been very lucky to have my own business during this time. I was already kind of working from home anyways, sort of, and then it was a transition to be able to do trainings exclusively over Zoom, but I feel better at it than I was at the very beginning. But being able to do more work because I'm not physically in a space, so I can do more training, I can do more consulting. And also, if I need to take a break, I can as well. That's what I did this summer. But coping, it's limited. Even, talk to my therapist twice a month. And I'm like, some of the stuff you can talk about it, but it just is like there's nothing to do about it. Like it's just getting through it. It's just doing the best you can. I know we're talking about coping, but for me, It's been physically devastating, this pandemic, because I've had problems with my muscles for several years, but not having access to a pool and then not moving around as much because of being at home. And I know this is an issue for a lot of people because I've a lot of people talk to me about it, has created so much body pain for me and so much illness. And it's been really mentally and emotionally frustrating and draining, physically draining as well. And I feel like I make a few steps to feeling better. Like the pool was open for a couple of months and then they've been closed this month for maintenance. And so it's opening back again in October, but it just feels like really slow, and everything just feels like so much effort during all of this. That's probably the trauma impacts. I'm hopeful that with less trauma, less stress, and more being out with people, being at ceremony, being at community gatherings, hugging people again, that will get better. Yet I don't know when that's going to be. It doesn't look great right now. And then I get back to being really angry with people who just don't care about the situation or believe all this bullshit that is just absolutely not even grounded in reality. Like, we have a large section of our population that is not grounded in reality anymore. And that's actually a really big problem. I'm not sure how to fix that. And also, I don't know, as an Indigenous person, that it's my fucking problem to fix that shit because I didn't create it. So just sticking that in there too.
All that, all of what you just said, right? I think that's a really important thing that like we don't talk about. Well, two things that you said that like we don't talk about enough is that the feeling, the like cycling through of feelings around like, okay, I'm going to hold on to this hope. I'm going to hold on to it. I'm going to hold on to it. Crap. Can we just like do the things so that we can go to the place we all hoped we were going to go to? And then getting angry and then going into that cycle and that spiral again. I feel that. I know other people that feel that way, especially folks that have been working on getting people access to care during the pandemic, right? And those of us that are experiencing chronic conditions during the middle of a pandemic. The other thing that you kind of mentioned was just that, like, the folks that are not grounded in reality, that like huge part of the population that believes in this thing that's just made up in the last couple months called medical freedom. What is that? You just made that up. That's not a thing. Like your health and well-being very much impacts everybody around you, whether you know them or not, whether you care about them or not. And I think that's one of those pieces that I was talking about too around like hypocrisy. And a lot of those folks are grounded in organized religion that talk about taking care of people, that talk about how like you're supposed to love your neighbor, that talk about all these other things that very much run counter to the actions of not getting vaccinated because I have the right not to get vaccinated. Instead of my choices to not getting vaccinated mean that your life and your quality of life, regardless of whether you are vaccinated or not, is impacted by my decisions. That people that don't have access to the vaccine are impacted by your decisions, right? Like all these other things, there's so many layers. We could go on and on about this, but
Well, it's not a new thing, right? I mean,
no,
this is just a wave of the same bullshit of like,
absolutely.
my freedom is me being able to do whatever the hell I want, when I want, where I want, and not thinking about the aspect of connection to your community and the people around you, the colonial idea of like a civilized society or whatever.
Yeah.
I remember had this conversation back in 2010 when I was in art school. I took a class and we were talking about what does freedom mean, and it was kind of like an elective class, and talking a little bit about government and a little bit about religion. And I remember this exact conversation with our instructor. He was like, freedom means something different than most of the people of this country understand. And I don't think this country is very free at
No.
all. It is an absolute marketing bullshit that this America is the most free country. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, even to the people who have a lot of privilege, there's still a massive amount of oppression, and you aren't as free as you actually think you are. You have been sold a bit of fucking goods. I think about it as railroads. Like there's these railroad tracks that people are on, and as long as you stay on your track, then you're quote free to do whatever you want, but you're still on a railroad track. Now try to get off that railroad track. Good luck with that. That's really, really hard to do, right? And some people are on a road that is rough. Other people are doing great. I know I feel like I'm kind of contradicting myself, but it's also like colonial structures are contradictions.
Yeah. And folks that come from privilege are still experiencing the impacts of colonization, whether or not they want to address it or not. You get put in the same box, your box just looks a little bit different and you got a few more dollars, right? You don't have to live in that box either. And if we work together to deconstruct colonization, move towards a decolonial perspective, re-indigenize our communities, whether that's healthcare, spirituality, governance, whatever you want to put in it, when we move towards that, it helps you just as much as it helps me.
And that is a concept that is lacking. People don't get that at all. And it's actually really terrifying to a lot of people. I run up against this. I know you run up against it when we do our work in organizations where you're like, this totally impacts you. But the thing is that people think it's this easy concept. People think that it's a yes and no, a binary. I'm like, this is spectrum. This is gray area. This is complex like a web. It's not linear. It's not easy. You're never going to be perfect at this. You're totally going to screw it up. Like there's these other skills and abilities that you really need to maneuver through what's really actually happening and to understand it. And I think that there's just a lack of awareness around that. And then once people become a little more aware, then they're like, well, what skills do I need? Okay, yeah, we can help you with that, but like you actually have to practice those skills. And there's a lot of performative bullshit going on. And it is incredibly harmful, right? So we have like the spectrum of people who have fallen for all of these lies and bullshit, right? Who don't really, I think, in some ways, either don't have the critical thinking skills to think about it or the common sense, or do and aren't engaging in those skills. And then you have people who are working on a little bit of awareness and have just enough information and terminology to then just be really incredibly harmful, whether they intend to be or not, and then you go further into people being more and more aware. And then you get to the place where people then are like stuck almost like inertia because it's so complicated and it's depressing and it feels hopeless. And then you keep, there's this, all of these kind of stages to work through. And of course, there's many more than I just talked about. And I think that all of that, the pandemic has brought up. And I think that people start to see the complexity. And then I think cognitive dissonance starts in their minds. And then our brains don't want to be in cognitive dissonance. It feels really uncomfortable. So then you have a choice. You're either going to move further and deepen your awareness and understanding, or you're going to move back and settle in and dig in to what you think is right, what you were taught, And I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about people in our communities who are believing in these conspiracy theories and this reality that isn't based in reality comes from a brain that is rooted in fear. It is much easier to manipulate people when they are in a mind state of fear. And so I kind of wonder if, there's always been conspiracy theorists. There's always been people who believe in QAnon. That was before the pandemic. But I'm wondering if, it got so deep, obviously, when you have a president who's spouting this bullshit, and then you've got misinformation, which we won't even go to where that misinformation is likely coming from. But I can tell you, I don't think it's coming from inside this country for its own nefarious reasons. And then the pandemic causing so much stress and so much fear and people being in sort of a trauma mindset, it's easier to manipulate people.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then it becomes really easy to sell things to people too, right? Like it becomes so easy to be like, you need 9 months worth of toilet paper in your garage. and you need a year's worth of water bottles, and you need,
And
right?
here's
Like,
this horse dewormer.
yeah, here's this horse
I
dewormer that will
mean,
definitely protect you. And
and I just want to say about that whole veterinary thing is that did not just come out of nowhere. There are people in this country who have used medicines from the feed store for a very long time. So it's not like all of a sudden these people were just like horse dewormer. I know people, there are people in my family who have used antibiotics from the feed store because it's cheaper and they don't have to go to the doctor. I know. I'm happy they're still alive. I'm surprised that they're still alive by doing this stuff. It's a fucking mess.
that's the reality, right? Like, what we're seeing, the pandemic, and this is not a new concept. This is not one that came from even my brain, right? This is something we know that Black and Brown people, that Indigenous people have said generations after generations. But definitely during this pandemic, there has been a lot of talk about this. The results, the disparities, the total mess that this country and the world are currently in during this pandemic is very much intentionally built and built on the back of colonization, right? It's built on the idea that we have systemic plans that have led us to this place,
Yeah.
right? This mess was created. It didn't just come out of nowhere.
Uh-huh.
Right? Like, these were all issues before the pandemic that are just like, oh, here's a spotlight, right? And again, not my idea. This is very much like conversation that's been happening in our communities and BIPOC communities for a very long time and throughout this pandemic,
Yeah.
right? That like the widening gap in disparities is not new, and it's intentional.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely intentional. And I would say that, and correct, I'm totally up to you critiquing what I'm about to say if you're like, I would say that, so if we're talking about colonial systems and institutions, so by that, I mean like government. Institutions are also things like the prison system, the medical system, schools,
Mhm.
religious institutions. I think even in some understandings of institutions, family is considered an institution. Really, any kind of organized structure that is creating cultural practice or creating and also maintaining those systems, that thinking, the practices, all of that. So, because of those institutions and how they work, along with things like capitalism being in there and patriarchy and things like that, this pandemic has shown the weakness within those systems. Or maybe not. Maybe it's shown those systems that you're working well because it's impacting folks of color and people with disabilities in such an intense way, right? It's accelerated that oppression. Does it make
Yeah.
sense what I'm saying?
I mean, like, yes, what you're saying is very much where I was at too. These are intentional designs, right? The
Yeah.
prison industrial complex is an intentional design, and it is doing what it is supposed to do, right?
Mhm.
And in the same way that healthcare was intentionally designed for some people at the literal expense of other people's lives, right? And that is true in all of our systems. The education system was not designed for BIPOC people,
Right.
right? And it was also not necessarily designed to be a critical thinking place, right? Like, it was not designed to train you to question things, right?
It's definitely not designed to do that. It's
Right.
designed, I mean, it has different levels, but at one level, it's designed for workers to work in a factory
Yes.
and to take orders. I mean, you can find K through 12 schools that are thinking about critical thinking, but those are probably schools that are geared towards upper class family.
Mhm.
I mean, the schools are definitely like an industrial revolution area. They totally need to be revamped, blah, 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 but they're not going to because whatever, because we of what we just said.
Colonization.
But yes, thank you. But what I was thinking about with the medical system, and this is probably a whole podcast in and of itself, but like I have compassion for doctors and nurses and staff who are dealing with this just horrendous situation. And I also, on the other hand, I'm like, and you fuckers have created this. Like, this is what the system does. It's almost like the pandemic is like a supercharged battery
Mhm.
of oppression. Like, it just
Yeah.
goes in there and like the system just gets turned up in such a way that you just can't. Well, I mean, you could ignore it or whatever, because clearly people have. So I have compassion for the individual people because I don't think that they're awful people. However, the system is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's just really amped up. And so my hope is that people who maybe haven't been as aware in our society about these systems are now being like, oh my God, what is happening here?
And unfortunately, I still think there's a lot of people that are just like, that's just that community's problem, or it's just that they're just like that, right? Like, for example, I had a conversation when the statistics came out about how impacted Indigenous communities were, specifically Native American communities and Alaska Native communities, and how a ridiculous amount of our community was dying. I knew that from just who I knew, but I also, like, when the numbers came out, I was having a conversation with my mom, and my one of my aunts was there, and she goes, "Oh, well, like, why do you think that is, that it's impacting the Native community differently?" And this is a white aunt. And I said, "Racism." And she said, "Oh, but like, why do you think that?" And I'm like, Racism." Like, racism is why. And she goes, "Well, is it because they just don't go to the doctor? Or is it because they don't want to take care of themselves? Or is it just because of the unhealthy lifestyle?" And I was like, "No, racism. It is directly because of racism."
Right. Because your aunt is seeing it from that individualistic
Yes.
perspective, right? Not from
Yes.
the systemic way of seeing it. Right. And that's one of the problems you and I run into all the time, people who do work like us. And that's a trap, right? It's a trap for multiple reasons. One, it's a trap because it's always the other person's fault. It's the individual person's fault. And then the institution or the systems never have a spotlight on them, as that's the actual fucking problem, right? I mean, and that's like part of the dynamic of these systems. Also, as somebody who goes in to sometimes government agencies, leadership and others in those agencies will get very angry and very threatened when you start talking about systems, because they think they're fucking talking about you. I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm talking about these systems. And it really causes a lot of barriers and problems when people keep thinking it's about them or thinking it's about the other person as individuals. I'm
Yes.
like, stop for a minute. It's kind of a weird selfishness, which makes sense. I'm glad that you were able to talk to your auntie, in that way, and to just say racism. But I also think most people struggle with having an analysis of understanding the difference between the two.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't think she heard me. I think she's still
Right.
trying to figure it out. Wait, but like, what did you do wrong? Or what did your culture or your people do wrong to like
Right.
not get the same access to resources in colonization that I have access to, right? Like, I still think that's the mindset that
Yeah.
exists there. And I think that that is the mindset that exists for like quote unquote well-meaning people in general. It's like, oh, let's fix,
Well, let's be
right?
clear. We're talking about well-meaning white people.
Yes, we are.
We've been a little coded in this conversation, but let's be clear. We're talking about well-meaning white people.
Yes. And this idea that if they can just figure out what you're not doing right, they will help you build the skills to exist healthily in white supremacy,
Yes.
right? And if you could just figure it out, right? And this is why we have social services. Like, let's not be, it's why we have social services. It's where social work came from. And I can say that I'm a social worker. Like, I get to say those things. And I recognize that, like, being part of that system and existing within that history means certain things, right? And one of those things is it comes very clearly from this mentality of, as white middle class upper class women, if we just treat poor black and brown people and help them learn the skills they need to navigate whiteness, then everything will be fine because they can exist within white supremacy. Instead of turning that around and saying, how do I actively dismantle white supremacy where I exist here today in my social location and make it so that everybody can access things in the way that they need to, and that access is not protected. That's a whole nother spiral, probably for a whole
That's a
nother
whole nother
podcast.
podcast. But it is like a little tantalizing view to our listeners of what you can expect coming forward, right?
Yes.
We have our different locations of where we do our work from. I'm, I guess, more of a systems thinker, thinking about large systems, thinking about how they work and how we're upholding them and how we can hopefully start dismantling them. But I think there's a really interesting and much needed conversation around what does dismantling look like? Because I think there's a lot of confusion over what that is. I think I have some confusion as well. Also, that's a lot of visioning, and I don't think anybody really has an answer for that necessarily. We have some examples we can talk about.
Well, I would love to talk a little bit just before we end on some of the like ways that we've coped that are like positive.
One of the things that Rosie taught me years ago was some really simple ways to help myself when I'm really stressed. And that is going back to the basics. And so for me, and the way she taught me those basics, and I think this is basics for other people as well, is smudging, drinking water, or blessing my face, washing my face with water, and praying, say some prayers. And
Yeah.
so those are basic things. Those are things you can kind of usually do anywhere. You definitely can pray anywhere. And so, I make sure I smudge myself. Journey is the only dog I've ever been around that doesn't mind being smudged. She doesn't like the smoke in her face, but she doesn't mind it on her body. And then I have a cedar tree really close to my patio. Then it rained, thank goodness, finally, the last couple of days. I know the trees were just so achy for rain. So I'm so thirsty. And so there's a little cedar tree close by, and there was a lot of water on it. So I got some of the water on my hands and I blessed myself and I blessed Journey with it and just put it on my forehead and on my chest. Just kind of thinking about everybody has different traditions of ceremony. And so I was just thinking about making prayer ties. I've been, working on that, saying prayers with prayer ties and then putting them on a tree outside my porch. And maybe some people in the community are like, that's not appropriate. That's not okay. I talked it over with Creator. I prayed about it and I was told, this is what you have access to right now. This is, what you can do and it's okay. So following those traditions and doing it in a good way, doing it in a way that I've been taught to do, not doing somebody else's culture or traditions. And then another aspect that I talked about earlier in this podcast is being in so much physical pain. And so moving my body is really important, but it's also a lot of pain to do it. So I came up with, in collaboration with my ancestors, because they are my life collaborators, is what are some movement activities that I can do that are accessible to me now and that don't make me feel horrible about myself or make my body feel worse. So I came up with, there's a beautiful pear tree outside of my house. And so walking around that pear tree with Journey. And so that's walking with the ancestors. I have like a little floor pedal machine, kind of like a bike, but it's just the pedal part. And that's pedaling with my grandmothers, right? And I literally made a poster for myself. It was movement with Mahaho, which is Mahaho is Cheyenne for creator. And so I have this list of different activities that I can do. Also, because for a long time the pool was not open. So what are some other ways to move my body? So for me, the pool is optimum. It's just easier and I get less pain afterwards. So the other thing, and this is kind of a funny thing, is that Journey and I have been working on, she loves to chase balls. Tennis balls are her favorite. And so I got one of those chuck it things where you can throw it a lot further without hurting your arm. And we have we live on the country, so we have a really big yard. So I can throw it really far for her, but because of who she is, she doesn't necessarily like to bring the ball back to me. And so we've been working on her bringing the ball back. Really, she wants to be chased, but that is not something I can physically do with her. So we've been working on her bringing the ball back, and she's gotten better at it. She doesn't usually bring it right to me, but maybe like 30 to 40 feet away. But what I've noticed is as I've been doing that over the last few weeks, she is placing the balls further away. And I feel like she on purpose is making me walk further incrementally. That is what I think is happening. So, anyways, I know I just talked and talked for a while, but I think, writing, creating art. One of the things also that I did this pandemic, which has nothing to do with ceremony, is I decided I wanted to review all of my favorite cereals from childhood and whether I think they still taste good. And so in my family, we were only allowed to have like sugar cereal when we went camping in the summer. And so otherwise we got like Cheerios and like Rice Krispies.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I purchased every time I would go to the grocery or order from the grocery store, I would order a different cereal to try again as an adult. And so some cereals I really like. One in particular might be a little obsessed with. And then several other of them, I was like, oh, this tastes so gross and horrible. So I think just like trying to find little things that bring you joy. I also don't make big meals. I literally make charcuterie boards all the time. I'm not actually making a charcuterie board, but I'm get out a plate and I put a little bit of sugar snap peas and some grapes and then maybe some salami and a different kind of cheese. That's sometimes what I eat as like a main meal because I don't have the energy or the like brain capacity to like cook. And I'm not a great cook. I'm very undomesticated really. So my dog is more domesticated than I am. So that's not true. But
I don't think that's true. I think that smudging has been a huge part for me of ceremony that I have. Also, learning new things has been a big thing for me. I made my first 2 pairs of baby moccasins during this time, and like my amazingly fat fingers with those tiny, tiny moccasins meant that I had like tiny, tiny prick holes all over my fingers. They got like bandaged up.
You're like they're like your war wounds.
Yes.
Like, you're counting Q on these damn baby moccasins. Or maybe the baby moccasins are counting Q on you. I don't really know.
Who knows? Yeah. But like learning how to do that. Then I started taking beading class with Shanoa. She's been having beading class at night, which is really just devolving into laughter. I don't know most of the time what's happening, but it's fun to be with other people that are also have no idea what's happening and trying to bead things. So that's been fun. Also, I am a big fan of cooking. I love cooking and I love cooking huge meals because I love cooking for other people. That's just part of like.
And I love eating your cooking. And I really miss that.
I think I went like over 400 days without ordering prepared food. And it was like both a great saver of money and also like exhausting. But I love learning like how to make new things, like how to make your own pasta or your own ravioli or how to make whatever. I made fry bread once every couple weeks, And now I'm solidly in the camp of order everything you can because I'm exhausted now.
Yeah.
So you do you. My point. Thank you for joining our podcast.
Thank you for listening to us. And this has been your Two Spirit Aunties sharing things with you. Hopefully you found it helpful, insightful. If you've been struggling similarly to us or even differently, we just want you to know you're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. This shit is really fucked up and really hard. Your brain and your body is doing the best it can. We totally love you. And we want you to get your shit together as we try to get our shit together.
You can join us on that journey of getting our shit together together.
It's never going to happen for me, but I'm really going to try. Have a good day, you all. And I think that wherever you're listening to this, whenever it is, we should have our contact information. And if you ever want to get a hold of us, Brianna's personal phone number, just kidding. We're not doing Our emails should be available to you. And if you have questions or feedback, as you know, we are always open, but I prefer feedback in a sandwich. So something positive, then the critical feedback, and then something else positive. I'm not interested in personal attacks, but I am interested in any kind of critique about the podcast. Just want to be clear.
That was the most trauma-informed request for feedback I've ever heard. So,
well, that's what I do. Trauma-informed care. I'm just telling you what I need. Brianna, what do you need for feedback?
Direct communication.
Okay. So if you're addressing Brianna, you can be direct in your communication. If you're addressing me, remember, I like the sandwich. Something nice and positive, the critique, and then ending with something positive.
I mean, I'll
love you forever. What?
I'm also going to say I like positive feedback, but whatever you need to share with me, I'm good.
She is emotionally tougher than I am. We are both badass bitches, but I am pretty sensitive. So
I think this is the 4th or 5th time we're going to say goodbye. And we are so glad that you are now part of our family.
Yay, more relatives.
Yeah. Who knew that was needed?
The more the merrier. Okay. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. And as always, we want to thank our amazing friend, Hannah Bueller, for editing and just being amazing. Thanks, Hannah.